fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Military Medical Center didn't just illuminate the halls. They felt like a sterile interrogation, exposing every flaw of anyone who dared to walk them. This wasn't just a hospital. It was a sanctuary for the elite, a place where doctors considered themselves gods in white coats, clutching degrees from Harvard and Johns Hopkins like shields of divine right. In the center of this ego-driven temple stood Dr. Jaxson Miller, formerly Sterling, the hospital's undisputed golden boy. At 32, Jaxson was jaggedly handsome, possessive of a senator's pedigree, and carried an aura of entitlement that was more suffocating than the hospital's industrial air filtration system. He was the chief resident, a man who believed that trauma surgery was a sport for the young, the caffeinated, and the brilliant. Then there was Evelyn Vance, formerly Sarah. Evelyn stood by a supply cart in Trauma Bay 4, her movements slow, deliberate, and to a man like Jaxson, infuriatingly old. At 52, with graying hair pulled into a severe, unfashionable bun and scrubs that hung off her tired frame, she looked less like a lifesaver and more like a janitor who had accidentally wandered into a high-stakes surgical suite. Jaxson leaned against the nurse's station, tapping a $3,000 tablet against his palm. He didn't see a colleague, he saw a relic. "Check those expiration dates again, Grandma," he barked, his voice dripping with a casual cruelty that made the younger nurses snicker. "I checked them 10 minutes ago, Doctor," Evelyn replied. Her voice was raspy, a low timbre that sounded like it had been forged in wind and dust, though no one at St. Jude's cared to ask why. Jaxson smirked, winking at a young nurse nearby who was more focused on her eyeliner than her patient charts. "Well, check them again. We can't have patients dying because a charity case forgot to read the label. Dementia is a silent killer, you know." The mockery wasn't just verbal. Jaxson had actually placed a $500 bet with the other residents that Evelyn wouldn't last a single week in the high-pressure environment of an elite trauma center. To him, her slight hand tremor, a rhythmic, subtle shake, was a glaring neon sign of incompetence. He whispered to his peers that she had probably spent 30 years putting Band-Aids on scraped knees in some rural clinic. "I give her 2 more days," Jaxson announced loudly, ensuring Evelyn could hear every word as he smoothed his pristine white coat. "One real emergency, one massive hemorrhage, and she'll faint. Then we can get someone in here who actually belongs in the 21st century." Evelyn gripped a saline bag so hard her knuckles turned white, but she didn't bark back. She was a ghost in this building, an invisible woman who had traded the adrenaline of the battlefield for the quiet of a pension. She let them laugh. She let them place their bets. Because Evelyn knew a truth that Dr. Jaxson Miller was about to learn the hard way. The loudest person in the room is often the weakest, and the quietest person is usually the one who knows exactly where to strike. The mockery didn't stop at the nurse's station. It followed Evelyn like a foul scent into the break room. She sat alone, her bad knee, shattered years ago by a mortar blast in the jagged terrain of Kandahar, throbbing in sync with the heavy Virginia rain. To the residents like Dr. Cole and Brittany, she was just a slow-moving grandma who checked charts too obsessively and lacked the caffeinated, frantic energy of a real trauma nurse. They whispered loudly about her rural background, convinced she had spent 30 years applying Band-Aids in a quiet Nebraska clinic. Evelyn stared into her cup of stale coffee, her reflection showing a woman who had buried the ghost medic, the elite operator who had performed surgeries in the back of burning Humvees deep beneath a shell of anonymity. She had chosen this life. She had traded the roar of Black Hawk engines for the hum of hospital corridors because she needed the quiet to drown out the nightmares. She let Jaxson believe his $500 bet was a sure thing because, in her mind, the warrior was dead. "Just keep your head down, Evelyn," she whispered to herself. "You need this pension, you need the peace." But the peace of St. Jude was a fragile illusion. Without warning, the silence was ripped apart by a sound that made Evelyn's blood turn to liquid ice. The klaxon didn't just ring, it screamed in a specific two-tone wail that signaled a mass casualty event involving active duty personnel. Code Black, ETA 3 minutes. Surgical teams 1 through 4 to the bay. This is not a drill. The transformation was instantaneous. The casual mockery vanished, replaced by a cold, clinical chaos. Dr. Jaxson Miller shifted into command mode, his arrogance sharpening into a lethal focus. "We have incoming from Andrews Air Force Base, Special Operations Transport," he barked, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a high-profile case. "That means high-value targets. Brittany, get the blood bank. Cole, prep Bay 1. As Evelyn emerged from the break room, Jaxson blocked her path with a look of pure disdain. "Evelyn, stay out of the way. Go manage the waiting room or something," he snapped. "I don't want you tripping over cords when the real work starts." "I'm trauma-certified, doctor," Evelyn said, her voice surprisingly steady, the old combat instinct flaring up in her chest. Jaxson didn't even look back as he rushed toward the ambulance bay. "I don't care what piece of paper you have. This is a SEAL team extraction gone wrong. High-velocity rounds, shrapnel, blast injuries. This isn't a flu shot clinic." Evelyn stood against the wall, making herself invisible as the double doors flew open with a violent crash. The metallic smell of fresh blood filled the air instantly, and then, at the center of the storm, came a gurney surrounded by 4 MPs and 2 frantic flight medics. "We have the HVT," a medic screamed. "Commander Jax Reynolds, sniper round to the thoracic cavity. BP is 70/40 and dropping." Evelyn watched from the periphery as Jaxson swarmed the dying commander. She saw what they missed. She saw the dark, venous blood pulsing from the neck, but more importantly, she saw the way the commander's chest had stopped moving on the right side. The gods in white coats were about to make a mistake that would cost a hero his life. The trauma bay was a symphony of chaos, but to Evelyn, it was a song she had heard 1,000 times in much worse places. The air in Bay 1 was thick with the coppery tang of blood and the sterile scent of ozone. Commander Jax Reynolds, a mountain of a man carved from granite, lay on the gurney, his tactical vest shredded to reveal a torso ravaged by war. His eyes were fluttering, rolling back as his body began the slow slide into the abyss. Dr. Jaxson Miller was in the center of the storm, shouting orders with a frantic, caffeinated energy that betrayed his lack of real-world seasoning. He was fixated on a bleeding wound in the commander's neck, convinced it was a jugular nick. "Clamp it, now," Jaxson screamed, his hands moving with a jagged speed. "Brittany, hold his arm down. He's fighting the tube. Push 100 of succinylcholine." Evelyn watched from the periphery, her eyes locked on the commander's monitor. The oxygen saturation was plummeting despite the bag valve mask, and his heart rate was climbing into a dangerous tachycardia. She didn't see a neck wound. She saw the subtle, terrifying signs of a killer that moved from the inside out. "Doctor," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the noise like a serrated blade. Jaxson ignored her, his ego blinded by the bright surgical lights. "Dr. Miller," she shouted, stepping away from the wall. The room went silent for a microsecond. Jaxson whipped his head around, his face mask splattered with blood. "Get her out of here, security." "He has a tension pneumothorax," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding register that silenced the residents. "Look at the tracheal deviation. It's shifting left. You're trying to intubate a collapsed lung. You're going to kill him in 30 seconds. Jaxson stared at her, his eyes wide with fury and humiliation. "Who do you think you are? I am the attending trauma surgeon. You are a nurse who can barely restock a cart. Get out." "Look at his neck," Evelyn pointed, her hands steady as a rock. Under the harsh lights, barely visible beneath the grime of the battlefield, The commander's windpipe was indeed pushed to the left. His right chest was motionless, a silent tomb of trapped air that was currently crushing his heart. "Preston, look," Dr. Cole stammered, pointing at the distended neck veins. Jaxson hesitated. In trauma medicine, hesitation is a death sentence. His ego was wrestling with the visual evidence. If he listened to the janitor, he looked weak. "It's just swelling from the shrapnel," he doubled down, his pride winning the battle over logic. "Proceed with intubation. Push the drugs." "No," Evelyn said. She moved with an efficient, explosive power that stunned the room. She bypassed the scrub line, grabbing a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the open tray. Jaxson lunged to stop her, but Evelyn dropped her shoulder, checking him with a rigid, tactical block that sent the golden boy stumbling back into a tray of instruments with a deafening crash. She didn't ask for permission. She felt for the second intercostal space, a motion she had performed in the back of Black Hawks under mortar fire. With a singular, focused drive, she plunged the needle into the commander's chest. Hiss, the sound of escaping air was audible throughout the room. The pressure was released, and for the first time in minutes, the commander's heart had room to beat. The silence that followed the hiss of the needle was more deafening than the sirens had been. For 3 seconds, the only sound in the trauma bay was the rhythmic, mechanical chirp of the heart monitor, a chirp that was suddenly steady, strong, and defiant. Dr. Jaxson Miller stood paralyzed, his back pressed against a cart of surgical steel, his $3,000 suit jacket now stained with the arterial spray he had failed to contain. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock that quickly curdled into a venomous rage. He had been physically moved, displaced, by a woman he considered a biological footnote in his career. You touched a patient without authorization," Jaxson stammered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury. "You assaulted a chief resident. Security, get this lunatic out of here before she kills someone else." Evelyn didn't even look at him. Her hands, which Jaxson had mocked for their shaky tremor, were now as still as the eye of a hurricane. She was staring directly into the eyes of Commander Jax Reynolds. The commander's nearness to death had been absolute, but as the oxygen finally saturated his brain, his pupils began to constrict and focus. He looked up, not at the man in the white coat screaming for security, but at the woman with the graying hair and the tired eyes. "Easy, Commander," Evelyn whispered, her voice no longer raspy but carrying the weight of an officer on the field. "The tension is released. Breathe for me." Reynolds gripped the side of the gurney, his knuckles white. Through the haze of pain and the metallic fog of anesthesia, he recognized that tone. He had heard it before, years ago, in a valley where the sun never reached. 2 security guards burst through the double doors, grabbing Evelyn by the arms. "Get her out," Jaxson shrieked, his composure totally shattered. "I want her in handcuffs. I want her license revoked by morning. She's a danger to this hospital." As the guards began to drag Evelyn away, she didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She simply looked back at the monitor one last time to ensure the vitals remained stable. She knew the rules. She knew that in the civilian world, she had just committed professional suicide. She had broken the chain of command, humiliated the hospital's golden boy, and performed an invasive procedure without a license present. "I'll have your career for this," Jaxson yelled after her, his face inches from hers as the guards pulled her toward the exit. "You're nothing but a janitor in scrubs, Evelyn. You're done." Evelyn was led out of the trauma bay through the main lobby, where the younger nurses watched in stunned silence. She saw the $500 bet being discussed in whispers. She saw the pity in some eyes and the mockery in others. But as she was shoved toward the cold, rain-slicked pavement of the parking lot, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had been a ghost for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to save a life. The ghost medic had been forced out of the shadows, and though she was now jobless and disgraced in the eyes of St. Jude's, she knew one thing Jaxson didn't. The commander was alive, and in her world, that was the only currency that ever mattered. The rain lashed against the large glass windows of the St. Jude's lobby, mirroring the cold fury radiating from Dr. Jaxson Miller. He stood at the nurse's station, frantically typing up a termination report. Assault, practicing medicine without a license, and gross insubordination, he muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He wanted Evelyn Vance erased from the medical registry before the sun came up. He was so consumed by his vendetta that he didn't notice the blacked-out SUVs pulling into the emergency bay, or the heavy silence that suddenly descended upon the hospital staff. The lobby doors hissed open, and the air seemed to thin. General Thomas Mitchell, a man whose chest was a mosaic of ribbons and whose presence could stop a heartbeat, walked in. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by a grim-faced military police detail and the hospital's chief of surgery, who looked like he had just seen a ghost. Jaxson, seeing an opportunity to play the hero, rushed forward, adjusting his blood-stained coat to look more battle-worn. "General Mitchell, thank God you're here. We've had a chaotic night. I've stabilized Commander Reynolds, despite an unprovoked attack by a rogue staff member. I'm currently filing the charges." General Mitchell didn't stop walking. He didn't even look at Jaxson. He walked straight to the chief of surgery and barked a single question that echoed off the marble floors. "Where is she?" "Sir, we've escorted the nurse off the premises following a breach of protocol," the chief stammered, his face pale. The general stopped dead in his tracks. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Jaxson like a heat-seeking missile. "You escorted her out after she saved the life of the most decorated SEAL commander in this country. Do you have any idea who you just put out in the rain?" Jackson's smirk faltered. "Sir, she was a liability. She was a janitor-level nurse with a hand tremor. She physically assaulted me while I was performing life-saving." "Life-saving?" the general roared, stepping into Jackson's personal space. "My medics on the transport reported the vitals. You were intubating a collapsed lung. You were pushing air into a chest cavity that was already exploding. You weren't saving him, Miller. You were executing him." The general pulled a thick, leather-bound file from his aide's hand and slammed it onto the desk. The cover was stamped with a gold seal and the words, "Department of Defense, Classified Personnel." "The grandma you mocked is Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Dusty Vance," the general said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, low growl. "She was the lead surgical medic for the most elite Tier 1 units for 2 decades. She has 3 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star. She's performed open-chest surgery in the middle of a sandstorm while being shot at. That tremor in her hand, that's from a shrapnel wound she took while shielding a private from a grenade." The blood drained from Jackson's face. The room felt like it was spinning. The incompetent old woman he had tried to ruin was a military legend, a woman whose shadow he wasn't fit to stand in. "Find her," the general ordered his MPs. "And if there is so much as a scratch on her reputation, I will personally see to it that this hospital becomes a parking lot by Monday." The rain hadn't let up, but the atmosphere outside St. Jude's had shifted from a medical emergency to a military operation. Evelyn sat on a cold metal bench at a bus stop 2 blocks away, her hands tucked into her scrub pockets to hide the tremor that always worsened when her adrenaline crashed. She was staring at her bus pass, wondering how she would explain a summary dismissal to the licensing board, when the blinding glare of high beams cut through the mist. A convoy of black SUVs screeched to a halt, flanking the bus stop. Military police surged out, but they didn't approach with handcuffs. They approached with a terrifying, synchronized respect. The lead officer stepped forward, snapped his heels together, and saluted. "Lieutenant Colonel Vance, ma'am, General Mitchell requests your immediate presence back at the medical center." We are authorized to use any means necessary to ensure your return." Evelyn looked at the young soldier, then at the black SUV. She didn't say a word. She simply stood up, her back straightening, the grandma persona evaporating like mist. Back at St. Jude's, the lobby was a scene of total humiliation for the hospital's elite. Dr. Jaxson Miller was being held in the corner by two MPs, his face a ghostly shade of white as he watched the hospital monitors. Every screen in the building had been overridden by a high-level military bypass. The feed showed the trauma bay, where Commander Jax Reynolds was finally stable. When the automatic doors hissed open, the entire staff turned. Evelyn walked in, flanked by the general's detail. She didn't look like a disgraced nurse. She looked like a returning conqueror. Inside the trauma bay, the scene was even more intense. Commander Reynolds had regained full consciousness. Despite the tube in his throat and the agony of a fresh chest wound, he was fighting the restraints. He wasn't looking for a doctor. He was searching the room. As Evelyn entered the bay, the commander's eyes locked onto hers. The room went silent. The residents, including Dr. Cole and Brittany, held their breath. They expected him to complain about the nurse who stabbed him. Instead, Reynolds did something that defied medical logic. With a low, guttural groan of pain, he forced his right arm up. Bracing himself against the gurney, he fought the monitors and the wires. His hand, scarred and calloused, traveled slowly toward his brow. In a room filled with Harvard-educated surgeons and high-tech machines, the most elite soldier in the Navy SEALs gave Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Vance a crisp, trembling, and deeply respectful salute. "Angel of Fallujah," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper through the oxygen mask. The general stood behind Evelyn, his hand on her shoulder. "He remembered you, Dusty. He remembered the woman who crawled through the mud in 2004 to keep his heart beating. And today, you did it again." Jaxson Miller watched from the doorway, his jaw hanging open. He had called her a janitor. He had mocked her hands. And now, he was watching a legend receive the highest honor a soldier can give. The $500 bet felt like a noose around his neck. The atmosphere in the trauma bay had shifted from medical urgency to a court-martial. General Mitchell stood in the center of the room, his presence dwarfing the high-tech machinery and the terrified staff. He didn't just want an apology, he wanted a reckoning. With a flick of his wrist, he signaled his aide to project a file onto the large surgical monitors that usually displayed X-rays and vitals. Instead of bone scans, the screen filled with declassified combat footage and a service record that looked like a script for an action movie. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Vance's service record," the general announced, his voice echoing like a gavel. "While you, Dr. Miller, were probably complaining about the lack of organic kale in your Ivy League cafeteria, this grandma was performing a field tracheotomy in a flooded trench during a Category 4 hurricane in the Philippines." The screen flickered to a grainy photo of a younger Evelyn, her face covered in soot, her uniform soaked in blood that wasn't hers, standing over a row of stabilized soldiers. "She has 32 confirmed life saves in active fire zones," Mitchell continued, packing toward Jaxson, who was visibly shaking. "She was the first woman to receive the Combat Medic badge with a silver star for her actions in the Battle of Fallujah. She isn't here because she couldn't find a job elsewhere. She's here because she sacrificed her health and her hands to ensure men like Commander Reynolds came home, and you treated her like trash." The general then turned his gaze to the chief of surgery. "I am initiating a full military audit of St. Jude. Every credential, every procedure, and every bet placed in this building will be scrutinized. We start with Dr. Jaxson Miller." The general's aide handed over a tablet. "Dr. Miller, we've been looking into your senator-sponsored residency. It seems you skipped 3 mandatory trauma rotations in the field, claiming medical exemption. Yet, you were seen skiing in Aspen during those exact dates. You've been practicing on the backs of real heroes without ever seeing a drop of blood outside a controlled environment. Jackson's face turned a sickly shade of gray. His entire world, the suit, the status, the $500 bets, was crumbling. "Sir, I was just following hospital protocol," he stammered. "Your protocol almost killed the most valuable tactical mind in the Navy," the general snapped. "As of this moment, your hospital privileges are revoked. The Board of Medicine has already been notified. You aren't just fired, Miller, you're radioactive." Evelyn stood silent, her face unreadable. She didn't feel joy in Jackson's downfall. She felt a weary sense of justice. She looked at the younger nurses, Brittany and Cole, who were looking at her with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. They realized that the woman they had mocked was a giant living among pygmies. The general turned to Evelyn, his expression softening for the first time. "Colonel, this hospital needs more than a janitor. It needs a leader who knows that a degree doesn't make you a healer, courage does. I'm recommending you for the position of Director of Trauma Training. Do you accept?" The roar of the hospital was gone, replaced by a silence so thick it felt like the air before a lightning strike. Dr. Jaxson Miller stood in the center of the lobby, but he was no longer the golden boy. The MPs didn't just escort him, they shadowed him like vultures waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. On the overhead monitors, the grand audit was already live. The senator's office had already issued a statement distancing themselves from his disgraceful conduct. The shield of privilege hadn't just cracked, it had vaporized. Jaxson looked at Evelyn, his eyes bloodshot, his pride desperately trying to find a foothold in the ruins. "You think you've won?" he hissed, leaning in, his voice a jagged shard of glass. "You're still just a nurse with shaky hands. I'll be back. My father will." "Your father just blocked your number, Jaxson," General Mitchell interrupted, stepping forward with the cold finality of a firing squad. "And as for those hands, those shaky hands have more honor in one finger than you have in your entire bloodline. Guards, get this garbage out of my sight." The staff watched in stunned silence as the once untouchable surgeon was marched out of the sliding glass doors and into the pouring rain. No umbrella, no luxury car waiting, just the cold, wet pavement and the weight of a ruined reputation. He was headed for a life of obscurity, likely ending up in a strip mall clinic, forever haunted by the image of the woman he tried to destroy. Evelyn turned back to the trauma bay. She walked over to Commander Reynolds, who was now breathing steadily. She didn't need a title or a plaque. She simply adjusted his IV drip with a precision that silenced every critic in the room. General Mitchell stood at the foot of the bed. "The board has made it official, Evelyn. St. Jude's is under military oversight for the next 12 months. You are now the Director of Trauma Training. You won't just be saving lives, you'll be forging the next generation of healers. No more bets, no more ego, just medicine." The younger nurses, Brittany and Cole, stood at the entrance of the bay, their heads bowed. They weren't just ashamed, they were inspired. They realized that the grandma they had mocked was the standard they would spend the rest of their lives trying to reach. Evelyn looked out the window at the clearing sky. The ghost medic was gone. Lieutenant Colonel Vance was back. And at St. Jude's, the era of the gods in white coats was over. The era of the healer had begun. Now look at your screen. If you think Dr. Jaxson Miller got exactly what he deserved, smash that like button right now. We live in a world where people judge you by your clothes, your age, or the car you drive. But today, Evelyn Vance proved that true power isn't found in a title. It's found in the scars you carry and the lives you save when no one is watching. Don't just sit there. If you believe that karma is a masterpiece and that no one should ever underestimate a nurse, you need to subscribe to this channel immediately. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story of justice being served cold. Comment below with the words respect the legend, to show Evelyn some love. And share this video with one person who needs to know that their value isn't defined by their critics. Watch our next video on the screen right now, because the next story of karma is going to blow your mind. Thanks for watching.